So the soul is depicted in really weird ways in contemporary and modern culture. You think of the Disney movie Freaky Friday, right? Like you swap souls or exchange souls or something like that. And this kind of has its origins in René Descartes, who was the French mathematician from the 17th century. And he wanted to make a very clear separation of the body and the soul. And so he said, the body is non-thinking matter, material. And the soul is thinking non-matter, immaterial thought or consciousness. So he's not sure how these things combine or how they fit together, but he knows they're very different. He has a very mathematical mind. He's very left-brained. And so he wanted to make that distinction very, very clear. So this is how we sort of get our modern ideas of the soul as a ghost in a machine, right? A haunted house. But this really isn't what the ancients understood the soul to be, and I'll talk about what that is and why I think that's a better answer to it. Okay, so a lot of this starts with Aristotle, who wrote a book or a treatise called De Anima, or On the Soul. So Aristotle was a 4th century BC philosopher. He was schooled by Plato, and he taught Alexander the Great, actually. So he's a pretty qualified guy. But he was mainly a marine biologist. He wasn't mainly a philosopher. And he wanted to account for various things that he saw, right? So Aristotle had a zoo. So let's say Aristotle's walking around a zoo, and he sees various things in it, okay? So like a rock or something like that. A rock doesn't move, and it's just there, it's stationary. But he looks over to the other side of it, or just to the side of it, and he sees a blade of grass, right? And over time, over days and months, he sees it growing, and it seems to be growing towards the sun, and it's doing stuff, so it seems like something's a little bit different about it, and that's pretty interesting, right? And then in that same little area, in that pen, let's say, there's this rhinoceros, right, or some donkey, and he sees it doing all sorts of different things. It's growing as well, it's using nourishment from food, and it's also social. It's engaging with other animals, it's playing with them, it's moving around, it looks at him. So it's doing all these different things. There's a certain dynamism about it, a certain X factor, if you will. And so that's pretty cool too. And then going up, he sees in himself, he has interior data from his own thoughts and feelings, but then also exterior data of what other humans do when they're around him. So it goes up and up, and he sees that there's something unique about these beings that separates them from other beings, right? Because the rock and the man share that they exist, but there's differences there. And so Aristotle needs to account for these in some way. Okay. So we need an explanatory principle for all these different things, why there's a dynamism about certain living things. And so this is where the soul comes in, right? So Aristotle, picked up by Aquinas, Augustine, they talk about vegetative souls with plants. So there's growth and nourishment and these sorts of things. And then sensory souls with animals. So you have sense cognition, which is just the 5 senses. You have sense memory, which is imagination, which is pretty cool. And then for men, you have all these things, right? Men and women, you have all these things with the vegetative soul, with the sensory soul, and you have these powers, though they're not the soul themselves. What we would have is a rational soul, because we have all these things, but also we have 2 things that I'll get to later, which don't need the body, or are not solely reliant on the body to express themselves, which are intellect and will, right? We can understand things even though we haven't seen them, and I'll talk about that later. And we can do things through free will. We can do things that make sense followed by reason. It might be helpful to know the Latin word for soul, which is anima, which means to animate, right? So something is dead, it's not animated. Something is living, it is animated. So that's the sort of principle behind the soul. It's a good keyword to keep in mind. Okay. So Aristotle wants to say that the powers of the soul are nested in the body. So they're nested in the DNA, right? But pure DNA, pure matter, is not going to be able to explain everything in a rational soul. And the matter itself isn't teleological. And by that I just mean purpose-driven. It's not going towards something, which could be nourishment, which could be social interaction, which could be logical thinking, right? The matter itself is not going towards that, but it's arranged in a way that pushes it onwards towards something greater. Okay, so this is what we would call a part of the soul, the form of the body. And form kind of sounds like shape, right? It sounds like just the shape you're currently in, but this is just not the right understanding of form. Form is more of the connection between all of the particles, all of the molecules of DNA in your body, and how they move you towards something that's human, right? Whether that's eating, whether that's social interaction, or something higher, like doing something that's hard, but that's good, right? Using the will. Okay. So genetics really explain everything that's happening within the soul of the plant and the animal, all plant and animal activity. So all of it is based on matter and the connection that it's brought to through the soul, but it's all nested in there. It's all reliant on it. So even imagination, right? So some of you own dogs, and you've seen that when they're sleeping, they'll kick and move and snarl sometimes, which seems kind of weird, right? Because you think, well, isn't dreaming a distinctly human act? And we know that humans can do that, but no, dogs can actually dream as well, and it's because they have sense memory. What they've experienced, what they've felt, what they've seen, even what they've tasted, is still in there. It's in their body, and it's in their soul. And we don't actually draw the sense memory from something outside of our current experience or our past experience. And I'll prove this with an example. Imagine, or try to imagine, a desert in Libya, Africa. If you try to do that, unless you've seen a photo of it or you've been there somehow, you're probably going to imagine something like the Mojave Desert in Arizona, which more Americans have been to, or a photo of a desert, you've had it on your desktop. And then you're going to combine, because Libya has a couple big towns, maybe the city of Jacksonville or some other big city like New York, into that skyline, right? But everything that you're putting together in your imagination right now or later is from your sense experience, is from your sense data. Whether you've been there or you've seen a picture, it's all from what you've seen already. So anything sensory is going to come from your experience, right? Okay, so those are animals. That's kind of the highest thing they can do, sense memory. And then moving on to humans, there's a couple things, though, that Aristotle wants to account for with an immaterial solution, with an immaterial remedy. And eventually go on to say that, well, Aristotle wouldn't, but other people in the tradition would say that the soul is immaterial because of these things, or immortal because of these things. Okay. So the brain obviously affects these things. Many materialists will say the brain is accountable for all these things, but that actually is not going to hold up under scrutiny for a number of reasons. One is that we have universal notions, okay? So imagine the area of a triangle. Area equals 1/2 base times height, remember in middle school. So with that, you've never actually seen in your entire life, I'm going to bed, a perfect triangle. In fact, nobody has. Every single triangle, even if it's done on a computer, is going to have slight variations in it that just, maybe even microscopically, have some sort of variation which makes it imperfect, right? That's the way it is in a material world. Things are symmetrical to the eye, but nothing at the microscopic level is actually perfect in dimensions. So you've never seen a perfect triangle, yet you know what a perfect triangle is. It's very mathematical nature. It's known to you through reason. So something besides matter, which is just you looking upon a triangle, would have to give you this knowledge, right? Same thing kind of goes with a, let's say, 87-sided prism, right? That sounds crazy. You can't actually imagine an 87-sided prism. right? You can imagine a prism with many sides in your head, but you can't actually imagine it, right? You could create it, but you can't imagine it in your mind. Yet you know what it is. You know what it is. You know its nature. You know that it has 87 sides, and you know that those sides are going to be very small based on the amount that need to fit into the small surface area there. So you know what something is without being able to imagine it. Okay. Also, things that don't exist but have being in some form. We can know what they are. So for example, a fun one is a unicorn, right? We know what unicorns are. They're horses with horns, basically, cone horns. But we've never seen one in our entire lives, right? But we can know that they can exist. So you can draw them, you can imagine them, but they don't actually have existence in the here and now. But the fact that we can know them, that shows that we can know things that don't exist to our sense data. Okay. And then just going into the brain, it's true that certain parts of the brain light up more, if you will, when you're thinking of them. So like the right side, this is an overgeneralization, is more of abstract thinking, creative thought. The left side is more logical and mathematical thinking. So that's true, but there's no redness, for example. There's no knowledge of absolutes and natures within your brain at all. So the fact that you know what humanness is, you know what it means to be human to some extent, you know what redness is, you know what it means to be red to some extent. Well, this doesn't actually pop up in your mind. This doesn't actually pop up in the brain. So there must be something immaterial to explain this. Also, when you get older, you obviously learn more things, you know more things, but this doesn't show with the brain's development, right? The brain does get larger, it develops, but at the rate at which it does, in which you know things, there's no one-to-one ratio for that sort of thing with molecules or with atoms. So there must be something else going on. What you know is not clearly correlated with the brain and its size, for example. So it's not a quantitative, but a qualitative data that you're getting with these immaterial facts, with anything you know. Okay. Another argument for it is that there's awareness or self-consciousness, right? So this self-consciousness goes away when you're sleeping, right? But when you're sleeping, there's nothing that is taken away quantitatively from your brain. There's nothing material that flies away and then comes back to you when you wake up, for example. But if the materialist is right, that there is no immaterial soul, which includes an immaterial mind, which has self-consciousness, then there must be something that leaves you when you're sleeping. But there's no evidence to prove that something material goes away while you're sleeping. Okay. Also, matter doesn't make judgments on its own, right? So we make judgments all the time, like where should I sit for this? Where should I go after this? What is good? What is wrong? These sorts of things. We have to make many of them on a daily basis. But matter can't do that, at least logically. There's no meaning behind matter going this way or that way. Matter can't choose what's right or wrong. It's purposeless. Unless there's something that's immaterial giving meaning to what's going on in the material world, there can be no judgment of right or wrong. And this is a self-contradiction because someone who says there isn't a soul wants you to consider his arguments and then judge that he's correct, ultimately. But if there's just matter, then you can't do that. There's just a series of chemical reactions going on. And so the argument itself wouldn't even hold up in its own system. Arguments can't at all, in fact. Okay. Also, there wouldn't be something very commonsensical would be contradicted if we accept that there is no soul, which is that there is no I, there is no me, there is no Max in that case. So matter cycles through you every 7 years, I think, when you're an adult. So every 7 years, if we say that there is no immaterial soul, something giving unity to what is the body, then you would be a completely different person, right? If there's only one thing, which is mere matter, to account for who I am, then every 7 years I would be a new person. But that's obviously absurd, right? If you look at baby photos of me, that's the same person. And it would lead to an insane world where, like, I guess marriage vows and priestly vows are invalid after 7 years because it's a different person, you know? So it just leads to all sorts of crazy conclusions that we can't possibly accept. Okay. So some more positive arguments and empirical arguments for the soul. So there's people who die in a hospital, who can actually tell you things that they couldn't have known unless they had some sort of part of them that wasn't just in their body, right? So people who are in comas, who are comatose, they'll be able to say crazy things. Like, for example, what was on top of a cabinet that they couldn't have possibly seen, they never moved, they never had been in that hospital room before, but this happens where they know, like, there was a penny on that cabinet. So they report experiences of being able to kind of see over everything that was happening, including their body. So things like that happen. And then a couple of my old professors at BC, they said that when they collected data on this, it could be, skewed, but 10 to 40% of people, or 20 to 40% of people, they said, have had experiences with ghosts, and there are probably maybe also angels in that, but they've experienced some sort of supernatural, spiritual experience with a being who must have had a soul to account for why they're still alive after they died. So when they met someone, their souls had been meeting through matter, whether it was a mother or a father or a cousin or a friend, and now, after that person has passed on, they've reported experiencing something, maybe asking for prayers, right, in purgatory, in the next life, right? So there has to be something that accounts for this kind of thing. Otherwise, people who seem like they're genuine are lying. Okay. There's also some other nifty arguments. You might think some are better than others. There's an argument from a cow, okay? So one day, you guys all have cows, right? Your cow's walking around and it's doing its thing. It's eating the grass. It's moving. And the next day, it's dead, unfortunately. It just passed away. But you try to account for what that was, what happened. And, you go to your other cow, multiple cows, right? And you put your hand under its nostrils and you feel the breath, right? You feel the breath. And then you put your hand under the dead cow's nostrils and you feel nothing. And you say, well, that's a clear empirical difference, right? In the Old Testament, the word for soul or the word for spirit would have been breath, right? So what that is, what animates you, is not just the capacity to breathe, for example, but that's a clear effect of it, or clear expression of it. And so that's something that changes, that has to be accounted for. Also, there's an argument using evolution, I find this interesting, that supports the soul, okay? So we've seen throughout history the development from lower to higher life forms, right? So you have the Big Bang, you have lots of rocks, you have lots of fire. Eventually you have organic life, amoebas and little organisms, going up to plants, animals, until we have us eventually, right? So this development is a sort of progress, right? It's better to have consciousness than to not have consciousness. It's better to be a snail than a rock, better to be a chimpanzee than a snail. It's better to be us than a chimpanzee. And so things are clearly moving towards something, right? But if you accept that human consciousness is all for naught, that life's just a cosmic abortion, at the end of everything, there is nothing, right? And the scientists will say that eventually, with entropy, things are moving away from each other. Space and time are moving apart. And so at the end, there's going to be blackness or nothingness. And we know this is true because of our faith, and I would say there's logical reasons for that too. But this is what there is without faith, basically. So things are moving up, and then without the afterlife, without a soul, things are just falling apart to nothingness. That doesn't make sense based on the trajectory that we've been on. We're moving towards something greater, just from a purely biological level or understanding. Okay. Also, the soul can't be quantitative, right? There's nothing that shows that the soul is there as like a material thing that holds everything together. And so if the soul is not quantitative, it must be qualitative. It must not have physical parts, right? And so what doesn't have physical parts doesn't decompose. Because what decomposes just changes matter. It changes from one being to the next, right? When your body decomposes, it goes to dust, which will eventually return to the soil and give rise to new life, like plants or for animals or something. But if the soul is not material, then it must be immaterial. It must live on, because death, which is just a change in the body, the soul separating from the body, doesn't actually affect something that's spirit or immaterial. Okay, another quick intuitive argument. We know that there's ultimate justice, right? We have this intuition that all things will be well. And we know that certain wrongs in this world can't make sense just within this world as a closed system. So certain terrible crimes, right? Like Holocaust, like slavery, these things, they must have some sort of solution that's not now. Because now, there's never proper justice for these things. There never is. And so there has to be something afterwards that shows that our moral intuition, which occupies most or a lot of our time, it comes to some sort of fruition or culmination. And so we would say a final judgment as Christians. But there has to be something afterwards, because there's too much injustice where there's a knowledge of justice in our interiors. Okay. Okay, so the next one is actually quicker. So it's the question, can miracles happen? So let me preface this with a definition to offer. So let's say that a miracle is a striking and religiously significant event in the system of natural causes. Okay? So note the two adjectives I used, striking and religiously significant. Okay. So something that's striking doesn't have to be a miracle, right? Apparently in Houston in the early 2000s, there was a bunch of rocks that got caught up in some sort of, not vortex, but some sort of wind pattern. And so there was literally rocks falling from the sky in Houston, which was crazy. So that's a striking event, right? But it's not religiously significant. There was no prophet that said, unless you repent of your sins, Houston, Texas, there's going to be this rock storm that comes and kills you. Now, if there was, let's say, a prophet saying that, let's say that in our case, there were very holy, pious nuns with the approval of the bishop and the pope. They were saying these things right before they happened, that some rock pattern would come and hurt the people of Houston. And there was no natural way to predict this, right, like a weather forecast. Well, then you could actually consider that a miracle. You could consider that some sort of intervention by God to show to his people that, in Houston, I suppose, that they need to clean up their act a little bit. Okay, so they have a significant or a striking character, and they have a religious character. That's the two sort of things. Okay, so and then I would also say a lot of skeptics or people who don't believe in miracles say, well, we have a closed system, right? So why would we open that up, or why would you open that up? And I would actually agree, and I would have to say, you would have to say that a closed system is necessary for miracles. Because if miracles happen all the time, if 50% of the time when you pick up a chair, it stays up there, then that's not a miracle at all. That's just the natural way of things in that system. And so you would have to have regularity or an ability to predict in order to have a miracle at all, right? So also let's talk about contradictions versus miracles, right? So if I said a man walked through that wall back there, that's actually not a contradiction. You know, a man could do that. It would be It's actually possible, scientists say, 1 in like billions on billions of times for that to happen, for the amount of particles to line up in a certain way, like a keyhole, which I think is interesting. But it is also possible, I think more likely, that that would only happen through a miracle of God. But a contradiction is more like saying a man walked through that wall as a sort of miracle, and at the same time, he was over 300 miles away, or he was not walking through that wall at the same time. So he was X and non-X at the same time. That is a contradiction. That is a contradiction. And that can't exist, right? Because the logos, logic, cannot be disproven. So it's not a contradiction, but it's some miraculous event that can take place in, yes, a naturally predictable system. There's also a difference here between actual miracles, right? And many of us, Father Rich talked about this, many of us have had miracles in our own lives, right? Or we know of them. We know of people who have had them. So I'm not talking about that at all, right? I believe that can happen and does happen all the time. But I'm talking about just the possibility, like can it happen at all on philosophical grounds? So if you're asking, did it happen? That's a historical question or just a question for a religious seeker. But if you're asking, can it happen? That's a question for a philosopher. So that's the one I'm investigating today. So I'm not really going to touch on what miracles there are. I'll let you make your own conclusions. Okay. So this comes back again to 2 weeks ago. The kind of God you believe in. Is he a clockmaker God? Did he just make things at the beginning and now he's checked out or doesn't exist or is not powerful enough? Or is God sustaining everything in being, which I proved last time? Is God intimately watching out for things and letting them be real causes? Yes, we have free will, but also guiding their every moment, their every movement. These things are not in contradiction. And what kind of God you believe in, what we've shown through the last 2 weeks, is important in if miracles can happen or if they're probable, which again is a historical question. Okay. So we also have, I didn't talk about this 2 weeks ago, but Big Bang cosmology, right? So in the 1950s, Father George Lemaitre, so Catholic priest, showed this. He showed that the world, the universe having a beginning is just as solid in science as the Earth being round, for example. That this is, as far as scientific theories go, proven, right? That there's a beginning. And so it makes sense that if God created the universe, he can add some smaller Big Bangs to make human beings better, to give them a better taste of his love and show them where to go. So if there was one giant Big Bang, it makes sense that the person who produced that could also produce lesser ones that are still miraculous, like the Incarnation, but ones that still operate within a certain natural boundary, right? Because even though Jesus was incarnated, he still followed the natural laws that happen through gestation, right? That happen through early development and development into his adult years, right? So God still respects his system. He's the one who created it, right? If anyone respects it. But he can intervene in miraculous ways, you know? If there was a cosmic embryo, right? Before the Big Bang, there was infinite density in matter and space in one little ball, if you want to put it like that. And then there could be a huge birth of the universe. There could be other things like that, right? He could even enter in as a storyteller, as a playwright, enters into his own play. The guy who made the Marvel movies, the director, he enters into his own movie every time as a side character. Mel Gibson, The Passion of the Christ. He does this too. So it makes sense that there could be miracles that still respect the natural system we have. Okay, let me go after the negative position, the anti-miracle skeptic. So one of the objections is that miracles violate the principle of the uniformity of nature. But this begs the question, right? What is uniformity of nature? Does it mean that every single time, without any single occurrence, there's going to be no sorts of differentiations, blips, that are watched out for by God in the natural process? Well, this assumes it. This assumes that there's a powerless God or an uncaring God. And again, that's a historical question. But you can't just assume the question when you ask a question. You have to be open. Okay. Another objection is that if you have an infinitely improbable event, right, if you drop a penny 100 times, gravity's going to take it probably 100 times, if I'm just doing it right now. So we can assume that every other time it's going to drop to the ground. There's going to be no sort of levitation, no suspension. Again, this assumes a certain kind of God, right, that he's powerless or he's not willing to make things that are very common, which need to be that way in order for a miracle to be even possible at all or to have any significance to happen. Another objection is it violates the scientific method. This isn't true at all. Someone who's a scientist, and I think most scientists who do neurobiology, for example, which has many miracles, right? Healings, I think most of them are theists, if not Christian. And this is just a certain understanding, a proper understanding of the limits of science, right? So someone who has brain cancer, who goes to Lourdes and gets healed, for example, a scientist who looks at that person says, well, certainly they're healed now and weren't healed before. And something needs to be given and account for that, and there's no natural explanation. So since there's no material explanation, I'll assume it's an immaterial explanation. And so the scientist realizes that science is a proper place and a good place, but something else has to be the explanatory principle here. Okay. Another objection is that if there has to be miracles, or there is miracles, then the universe, or God, is deficient, right? He needs to step in to stop the game, to change the rules. This would make the universe seem not proper, or not right, or not perfect. So this assumes that, first of all, there's no fallen nature. The world doesn't have any problems on its own, or that we've created in it. And also it doesn't assume that, it assumes that God didn't mysteriously will, right, in his allowance, in his mystery, for prayer, for example, to have any effect, for his Son to have any effect on the world, to come in. And so Pascal, the French philosopher, says that God allows us to pray so we can be causes, we can affect things. And so if God wants us to be elevated, right, to really affect the way of things, then prayer is a good way to do that. And in order for prayer to be effective, there had to have been an option not to pray at all, right? Okay.